The wind cut through the Montana territory like a knife, and Thomas Whitmore pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. October had arrived early this year, bringing with it the kind of storm that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. The 28-year-old rancher had been checking his cattle when the blizzard hit, and now he was making his way back to the ranch house as fast as his horse could manage. Thomas wasn't built for this kind of life. Not really. He was tall and lean, with soft hands that still showed he was more comfortable with books than branding irons. When his father died 6 months ago, Thomas inherited the struggling cattle ranch along with all its problems. The bank was breathing down his neck. Half his cattle had died from disease, and most days he wondered if he should just pack up and head back east to his teaching job, but something about this land held him. Maybe it was the way the mountains looked in the morning light, or how quiet everything got after a fresh snowfall. His father had loved this place, had fought to build something here, and Thomas felt like giving up would be betraying that memory somehow. The snow was getting heavier now, thick flakes that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. His horse, a sturdy mare named Bessie, was getting nervous, her ears twitching at every sound the wind made. Thomas patted her neck and spoke softly to keep her calm. They were almost home when he saw something that made him pull up short. There, huddled against a fallen tree about 50 yards off the trail, was a figure wrapped in what looked like a thin blanket. At first, Thomas thought it might be a lost traveler, maybe someone whose wagon had broken down. But as he rode closer, squinting through the snow, he realized it was a woman. And she was shaking so hard he could see it from where he sat. Thomas had heard plenty of stories about what happened to lone white men who got too close to the local tribes. The newspapers were full of warnings about savage attacks and scalping parties. Most of the ranchers in the area kept loaded rifles by their doors and shot first when they saw any sign of trouble. But looking at this woman, all Thomas could see was another human being who was about to freeze to death. He climbed down from his horse and approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held no fear, only a kind of weary acceptance. Her long black hair was dusted with snow, and her lips had that blue tinge that meant hypothermia was setting in. She was young, maybe early 20s, with the kind of beauty that would have turned heads in any city back east. The woman said something in a language Thomas didn't understand, then tried again in broken English. "Cold," she managed, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely get the word out. Without thinking, Thomas started unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. It was the warmest thing he owned, lined with fleece and built to handle the worst weather Montana could throw at a man. His mother had sent it from Boston when she heard he was staying on the ranch, worried about her city-raised sons surviving a frontier winter. "Here," he said, holding out the coat. "Take this." The woman stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Thomas realized she probably wasn't used to white men offering help without wanting something in return. Hell, most of the men he knew wouldn't help a white woman if it meant giving up their coat in weather like this. She reached out with trembling hands and took the coat, wrapping it around herself like it was made of gold. It was way too big for her, hanging down past her knees, but it swallowed her up in warmth. For the first time since he'd found her, she stopped shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, and Thomas was surprised at how clear her English was when she wasn't chattering from cold. "Can you ride?" he asked, gesturing toward Bessie. "I can take you somewhere warm." The woman shook her head and pointed toward the hills. "Home close," she said. "I walk." Thomas wanted to argue, but something in her expression told him she knew what she was doing. This was her land, after all. She probably knew these trails better than he ever would. "Keep the coat," he said as she started to move away. "Really?" "Keep it." She paused and looked back at him, studying his face like she was trying to memorize it. Then she nodded once and disappeared into the swirling snow, moving with the kind of quiet grace that comes from a lifetime of walking in the wilderness. Thomas stood there for a moment, watching the spot where she'd vanished. The cold was already starting to bite through his thin shirt, but he felt strangely warm inside. He'd done the right thing, he was sure of that. His mother had raised him to believe that kindness was never wasted, that treating people with decency was its own reward. He climbed back onto Bessie and urged her toward home. The storm was getting worse, and he needed to get inside before he ended up as frozen as the woman had been. As they rode, he found himself thinking about her eyes. There had been something there, a kind of intelligence and strength that you didn't often see. She wasn't just some lost traveler. This woman belonged to these mountains in a way Thomas was still learning. By the time he reached the ranch house, his teeth were chattering and his fingers were so numb he could barely work the door latch. Jake, his only remaining ranch hand, met him at the door with a cup of hot coffee and a concerned look. "Where's your coat, boss?" Jake asked. He was a grizzled old-timer who'd worked for Thomas's father for 20 years, and he had the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving hard winters. "Gave it to someone who needed it more," Thomas said. Wrapping his hands around the warm mug, Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't push for details. He'd learned that Thomas wasn't like other ranchers around here. The young man had strange ideas about treating people fairly. Regardless of who they were or where they came from, Thomas spent the evening by the fire, trying to warm up and thinking about the encounter. He wondered if the woman had made it home safely, if his coat was keeping her warm. Part of him worried that he'd made a mistake, that his kindness might be seen as weakness or worse. But mostly he felt good about what he'd done. The storm raged all night, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors. Thomas fell asleep listening to the wind howl around the house, completely unaware that his simple act of kindness had just changed the course of his life forever. He had no idea that the woman he'd helped was someone very important, someone whose family had the power to either make him rich or destroy everything he'd worked for. Tomorrow would bring consequences he never could have imagined. But tonight, Thomas Whitmore slept peacefully, knowing he'd done right by another human being when it mattered most. Thomas woke up to someone pounding on his door like the house was on fire. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, just a pale gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows. He rolled out of bed, his body still aching from the cold ride the night before, and stumbled toward the front door in his long underwear. Boss, you gotta see this." Jake's voice was higher than usual, carrying a note of panic that made Thomas's stomach drop. In all the years Jake had worked the ranch, Thomas had never heard him sound scared. Thomas threw open the door to find his ranch hand standing there with wild eyes, his hat crooked and his breath coming out in quick puffs. Jake was pointing toward the eastern fence line, his hand shaking slightly. "What is it, Jake? What's wrong?" Thomas asked, following the man's gaze. Just look," Jake whispered. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, the cold morning air hitting him like a slap. He squinted toward where Jake was pointing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing through the morning mist. At first, it looked like a dark line along the horizon, maybe a shadow cast by the mountains. But as his eyes adjusted, the blood in his veins turned to ice water. There, stretching along his entire eastern fence line, was a sight that would have made most frontier settlers run for their lives. Horses, dozens and dozens of horses, maybe more than 100, standing perfectly still in formation. And on each horse sat a warrior, painted and armed, watching his ranch house with the patience of men who had all the time in the world. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas breathed, his knees going weak. He grabbed the porch railing to steady himself, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The warriors weren't moving, weren't making any noise, weren't doing anything threatening. They were just there, like they'd grown up from the earth overnight. Some carried lances decorated with feathers and strips of colored cloth. Others had boughs slung across their backs. The war paint on their faces caught the early morning light, creating a display that was both beautiful and terrifying. "How many do you think there are?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake was counting under his breath, his lips moving as he pointed at different sections of the line. "I make it close to 200, boss. Maybe more. I ain't never seen nothing like this, not in 40 years on the frontier." 200. The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd heard stories of war parties, but those usually involved maybe 20 or 30 warriors at most. This was something else entirely. This was an army. "What do you think they want?" Thomas asked, though part of him was already starting to suspect the answer. I don't know, boss, but I got a bad feeling about this. Jake wiped his forehead with his sleeve, despite the cold morning air. Maybe we should ride into town, get the sheriff. Thomas nodded, though he couldn't take his eyes off the line of warriors. There was something almost ceremonial about the way they were arranged, like they were waiting for something specific to happen. They weren't behaving like a raiding party. Raiders would have attacked under cover of darkness, would have come screaming and shooting. These men were displaying themselves deliberately, making sure they were seen. Go saddle the horses, Thomas said finally. But Jake, don't make any sudden movements. Don't do anything that might look threatening. Jake nodded and hurried toward the barn, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. Thomas went back inside to get dressed, his hands shaking as he pulled on his clothes. He kept thinking about the woman from the night before, about the coat he'd given her. Could this be connected somehow? It seemed impossible, but the timing was too strange to be a coincidence. The ride to town felt like the longest 20 minutes of Thomas's life. Every few hundred yards, he'd glance back at his ranch, expecting to see smoke rising from burning buildings. But the warriors remained motionless. Watching but not acting, Sheriff Reynolds was drinking coffee outside his office when Thomas and Jake came thundering down the main street. He was a heavy-set man with gray whiskers and eyes that had seen too much violence over the years. When he saw the panic on their faces, he immediately set down his cup. "What's got you boys riding like the devil's behind you?" Reynolds asked. "Sheriff, you ain't gonna believe this," Thomas said, dismounting quickly. "There's about 200 warriors lined up along my eastern fence. Just sitting there, waiting." Reynolds's expression went from casual interest to deadly serious in the space of a heartbeat. 200? You sure about that number? Pretty sure, Jake said. Maybe more. The sheriff was already moving, shouting orders to his deputy to round up every able-bodied man in town. Within minutes, word was spreading through the settlement like wildfire. Shop owners came running out of their stores, farmers left their morning chores, and even the preacher abandoned his sermon preparation. The ride back to the ranch was like leading a parade of fear. 23 men followed Reynolds, all armed, and ready for what they assumed would be their last fight. Most of them had never seen more than a handful of warriors at once, and the idea of facing 200 was almost beyond their imagination when they crested the hill overlooking Thomas's ranch. The entire group fell silent. Even Sheriff Reynolds, who'd fought in Indian wars before Montana was even a territory, let out a low whistle of amazement. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I ain't never seen anything like this." The line of warriors stretched even further than Thomas had first thought. In the morning sunlight, he could see the intricate details of their war paint, the eagle feathers in their hair, the careful way their horses were arranged. This wasn't chaos or random violence. This was organization on a scale that spoke of serious leadership and planning. "What do you think they're waiting for?" asked Pete Morrison, who owned the general store in town. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Maybe they're waiting for us to make the first move," suggested another man. Sheriff Reynolds studied the scene through a pair of field glasses, his weathered face creased with concentration. "No," he said finally. "If they wanted to attack, they'd have done it already. A force that size could have overrun the ranch and half the territory before sunrise. They're waiting for something else." Thomas felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "Sheriff, I think I might know what this is." "About?" Every head turned toward him, and suddenly Thomas found himself the center of attention in a way he'd never wanted to be. He thought about the woman in the storm, about the gratitude in her eyes when he'd given her his coat. He thought about how she'd seemed to know exactly where she was going, how she'd moved through the wilderness like she belonged there. "Last night," he began slowly, "during the storm I found someone who needed help." The story came out in fits and starts, with Thomas trying to explain without making himself sound like a fool or a traitor. He told them about finding the woman nearly frozen, about giving her his coat, about how she'd disappeared into the storm. When he finished, the group of men exchanged glances that ranged from disbelief to anger. "You gave aid to a hostile?" One of the farmers asked, his voice rising. Are you out of your mind? She was freezing to death, Thomas replied, feeling defensive. I couldn't just leave her there. Sheriff Reynolds held up a hand for quiet, his eyes still fixed on the line of warriors. Well, boy, he said grimly, looks like your good deed might have brought us more attention than any of us bargained for. For what felt like hours, the two groups stared at each other across the open ground. The warriors remained perfectly still on their horses, while the townspeople clustered behind Sheriff Reynolds, whispering nervously and checking their weapons. Thomas found himself caught in the middle, literally and figuratively, wondering if his simple act of kindness was about to start a war. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing just how impressive the gathering really was. Thomas could see now that these weren't just random fighters thrown together for a raid. The horses were magnificent animals, well-fed and carefully groomed. The warriors' equipment was top quality, their weapons polished and their paint applied with artistic precision. This was a formal assembly, not a war party. Somebody's got to do something, muttered Pete Morrison, shifting nervously from foot to foot. We can't just stand here all day waiting for them to make a move. Sheriff Reynolds nodded grimly. Problem is, I don't speak their language, and I doubt any of them speak ours well enough for serious talking. That's when something unexpected happened. From the center of the line of warriors, an older man nudged his horse forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The horse stepped carefully through the tall grass, covering the 100 yards between the two groups with measured dignity. The man was probably in his 60s, with gray streaking his long black hair and deep lines carved into his weathered face. Unlike the younger warriors, he wore no war paint, just simple buckskin clothes decorated with intricate beadwork. There was something about the way he carried himself that commanded respect, even from men who'd spent their lives fearing his people. He stopped about 20 feet away from the group of townspeople and raised one hand in what was clearly a peaceful greeting. When he spoke, his English was slow and careful, but perfectly understandable. I am Gray Wolf, speaker for the tribes, he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. I come to talk, not to fight. Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward, though Thomas noticed his hand never left his pistol grip. I'm Sheriff Reynolds. What do you and your people want here? Gray Wolf's eyes swept over the group of white men before settling on Thomas. There was something in that gaze that made Thomas's stomach tighten with anticipation. We come to honor the white man who helped White Moon in the storm, Gray Wolf said simply. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. White Moon. The woman he'd given his coat to had a name, and apparently that name meant something significant to these people. White Moon? Sheriff Reynolds asked, glancing back at Thomas. Who's White Moon? Gray Wolf's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. White Moon is daughter of Chief Running Bear. She is precious to our people, like the daughter of your greatest leader would be precious to you. The implications of those words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Thomas felt his knees go weak as he realized what he'd stumbled into. He hadn't just helped some random traveler. He'd aided the daughter of a chief, someone important enough to bring together warriors from what looked like multiple tribes. Chief Running Bear? Sheriff Reynolds' voice had gone hoarse. Every man on the frontier knew that name. Running Bear was one of the most powerful war leaders in the territory, a man whose very name could empty settlements and send cavalry units scrambling for reinforcements. Yes, Gray Wolf nodded. Running Bear leads the Crow, but also here are Blackfeet, Cheyenne, some Lakota. All come when they hear what the young rancher did for White Moon. Thomas found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Is she ... Is she all right? Gray Wolf turned his full attention to Thomas, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She lives because of your kindness. Your coat kept her warm until she reached our camp. Without it, the storm would have taken her. The old man paused, letting that sink in before continuing. White Moon told her father about the white man who gave his coat to a stranger in the snow. She said you asked for nothing, expected nothing, you helped because it was right to help. Around Thomas, he could hear the townspeople murmuring in amazement and fear. Pete Morrison was shaking his head in disbelief, while Jake looked like he might faint. Sheriff Reynolds was calculating odds, probably wondering if his 23 men could hold off 200 warriors if things went wrong. So what happens now? Reynolds asked, his lawman's training keeping his voice steady despite the circumstances. Gray. Wolf gestured toward the line of warriors behind him. These men come to see the white rancher who showed honor to one of our own. In our way, kindness must be answered with kindness. Bravery must be honored. Bravery? Thomas couldn't help but ask. I just gave her my coat. You gave your coat? To someone you thought was your enemy, Gray Wolf replied. In the storm, in the dark, you could not know if she was friend or enemy, but you helped anyway. This is bravery. The old man reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out something that made Thomas's breath catch. It was his coat, the heavy wool jacket his mother had sent from Boston. But it had been transformed. The plain brown wool was now decorated with intricate beadwork, beautiful patterns in blue and white and red that caught the morning sunlight. White Moon worked all night to honor your gift, Gray Wolf explained, holding the coat out toward Thomas. She added the work of her hands to show respect. Thomas stepped forward on unsteady legs and took the coat. It was still his jacket, but it had become something more, something beautiful and meaningful in a way he'd never expected. The beadwork was incredibly detailed, clearly the product of hours of careful labor. She wants you to know that kindness between peoples is rare, Gray Wolf continued. But when it happens, it should be remembered. It should be celebrated. Sheriff Reynolds cleared his throat nervously. That's real nice, but what about all these warriors? Are they planning to stay? Gray Wolf shook his head. They came to see. Now they have seen. Soon they will return to their homes, but they will remember. They will tell their children about the white rancher who showed kindness to White Moon. The old man turned back to Thomas one more time. Chief Running Bear wishes to speak with you. He sends invitation to come to our camp to accept the gratitude of our people properly. Thomas felt every eye in the group turn toward him. Going to a Native American camp was something most white settlers would never even consider. It was dangerous, possibly fatal, and certainly not something a struggling rancher should be doing. If he wanted to stay in good standing with his neighbors, but looking at the transformed coat in his hands, feeling the weight of 200 warriors, who had traveled from across the territory just to honor a simple act of kindness, Thomas realized this was bigger than his own comfort or safety. When? He asked quietly. Tomorrow, when the sun reaches the middle of the sky, Gray Wolf replied. Come alone. Bring nothing but yourself and open heart. With that, the old man turned his horse and rode back toward the line of warriors. Within minutes, the entire assembly began to move, not dispersing randomly, but pulling back in the same organized formation they'd maintained all morning. They were leaving as dramatically as they'd arrived, but Thomas knew this was far from overdone as the last warrior disappeared over the ridge. Sheriff Reynolds turned to Thomas with a look of complete bewilderment. Boy, he said slowly, what in the hell have you gotten yourself into? Word spread through the territory faster than wildfire. By noon, riders were galloping between settlements, carrying news of the massive gathering at the Whitmore Ranch. Each telling made the story bigger and more frightening. 200 warriors became 300, then 500. A peaceful meeting became a siege, then a massacre barely avoided. Thomas sat on his porch, still holding the beautifully decorated coat, watching dust clouds on the horizon as more and more people rode toward his ranch. What had started as a simple encounter was turning into something he couldn't control, and the weight of it was crushing down on his shoulders. Jake paced back and forth in front of the house, his rifle clutched in his weathered hands. Boss, I got a real bad feeling about this, real bad. Look at all them folks coming this way. Thomas counted at least 30 riders approaching from the direction of town, and more coming from the other settlements. These weren't curious neighbors, coming to hear the story. These were armed men riding hard, kicking up clouds of dust that spoke of serious purpose. The first group to arrive was led by Colonel Harrison, a retired cavalry officer who'd made his fortune in mining claims. He was a big man with a voice that could carry across a battlefield, and he used it now as he dismounted near Thomas's porch. "Whitmore," he bellowed. "What in the name of Sam Hill do you think you're doing out here?" "I'm not doing anything, Colonel," Thomas replied, standing up slowly. "I'm just sitting on my own porch. Don't play games with me, boy." Harrison's face was red with anger and exertion. "Half the territory is talking about how you've been making deals with hostiles. Some are saying you're planning to lead them against the settlements." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "That's not true. I never made any deals with anyone." But Harrison wasn't listening. He was addressing the growing crowd of armed men who'd gathered in Thomas's yard. "Men, we've got a situation here that threatens every family in this territory. When settlers start collaborating with savages, it puts all our lives at risk." More riders kept arriving, and Thomas recognized faces from towns he'd never even visited. News had spread beyond the local area, bringing men from settlements 50 miles away. They all had the same look in their eyes, the same mixture of fear and anger that came from believing their families were in danger. "Now, hold on just a minute," Sheriff Reynolds said, trying to restore some order. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves here." Thomas helped a woman who was freezing to death. "That's all that happened, that's all?" shouted a voice from the crowd. Thomas turned to see William Fletcher, who owned the largest ranch in the county. "That woman was Chief Running Bear's daughter. Do you have any idea what that means?" The crowd erupted in angry voices, all talking at once. Thomas caught fragments of the conversations, and each piece made his blood run colder. Running Bears killed more white folks than any chief in the territory. This could be the start of a full uprising. Maybe Whitmore's been planning this all along. We should run him out before he gets us all killed. Thomas tried to speak up to explain what had really happened, but his voice was lost in the chaos. No one wanted to hear about kindness or human decency. They wanted someone to blame for their fear, and he was the obvious target. That's when the newspaper man arrived. Calvin Porter ran the territorial newspaper, and he had a talent for turning small incidents into front-page sensations. He pulled out a notebook and started scribbling as fast as he could write, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a big story. "Mr. Whitmore," Porter called out, pushing through the crowd, "is it true that you've entered into some kind of alliance with Chief Running Bear?" "No, that's not true at all," Thomas said, but Porter was already writing. "What about reports that you're planning to provide safe passage for war parties through your land?" "That's completely false. I never said anything like that." But Thomas could see that his denials weren't making any difference. Porter kept asking loaded questions, each one designed to make him sound guilty no matter how he answered. The crowd was getting angrier, feeding off each other's fear and suspicion. Jake stepped up beside Thomas, his old face grim with determination. "You folks need to back off. Thomas is a good man who did a good thing. Ain't no crime in helping someone who's freezing to death." "Shut up, old man," someone yelled. "You're probably in on it too." That's when Thomas realized how dangerous this situation was becoming. These weren't rational people having a discussion. This was a mob, and mobs did terrible things when they got worked up enough. Colonel Harrison raised his voice again, cutting through the noise. "Men, we need to think about what's best for our families. If Whitmore has opened some kind of communication with Running Bear, maybe we can use that." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Use it how?" "Well," Harrison continued, his eyes calculating, "if you've got influence with these people, maybe you could convince them to move on. Find somewhere else to set up their camps, somewhere that's not so close to our settlements." "I don't have any influence with anyone," Thomas protested. "I gave a woman my coat, that's it." But he could see that nobody believed him. They were convinced he'd somehow become a go-between, a white man with special access to Native American leadership. The idea was both ridiculous and terrifying. The crowd kept growing throughout the afternoon. By evening, there were over 100 men camped around Thomas's ranch, all armed and all convinced that they were on the verge of an Indian war. They'd brought supplies for a long stay, and some had even sent for their families. turning the gathering into an impromptu military camp. Thomas found himself a prisoner in his own home, watched constantly by men who didn't trust him but needed him at the same time. They wanted him to use his supposed influence to protect them, but they also suspected him of being a traitor. As night fell, the situation got even worse. Someone had brought whiskey, and drunk men with guns were never a good combination. Arguments broke out over what should be done, with some calling for Thomas to be arrested and others demanding that he be forced to negotiate on their behalf. "Maybe we should just burn the place down," Thomas heard someone suggest. "Send a message that we don't tolerate Indian lovers in this territory." Jake never left Thomas's side, his rifle ready and his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. "Boss," he whispered, "these folks are getting themselves worked up to do something stupid." "Real stupid." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the decorated coat where it hung on his chair. White Moon had worked all night to create something beautiful, to honor a simple act of kindness. Now that same kindness was threatening to destroy everything he'd built. Outside, the men continued to argue and drink and plan. Some wanted to attack the Native American camps preemptively. Others thought Thomas should be used as a bargaining chip. A few even suggested that the whole thing was a trap, that Thomas had been working with Running Bear all along to lure settlers into an ambush. As Thomas sat in his house, surrounded by angry voices and the smell of gun oil, he realized that his simple act of human decency had created something much bigger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Tomorrow he was supposed to meet with Chief Running Bear, but tonight he wasn't even sure he'd survive the good intentions of his own people. Thomas barely slept that night. Every time he started to drift off, angry voices from the camp outside would jolt him awake. The men had built fires and were taking turns standing guard, convinced that a massive attack was coming at any moment. Through his window, he could see their shadows moving around the flames, weapons always in hand. When dawn finally broke, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He was going to keep his appointment with Chief Running Bear, no matter what the consequences might be. The angry mob outside his house had shown him something ugly about his own people, and he needed to see the other side of this story for himself. Jake was waiting for him in the kitchen, a cup of coffee steaming in his weathered hands. The old ranch hand looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes red-rimmed and worried. "You sure about this, boss?" Jake asked quietly. "Those folks outside ain't gonna like you riding off to meet with Running Bear. Some of them are talking about following you, making sure you don't make any deals they don't approve of." Thomas pulled on his boots and reached for the decorated coat. The beadwork caught the morning light, reminding him of the hours White Moon had spent transforming his simple gift into something beautiful. "I gave my word, Jake. A man's word has to mean something." "Your word might get you killed," Jake replied bluntly. "Maybe, but breaking it might get a lot more people killed." Thomas walked outside to find Colonel Harrison waiting for him along with about 20 other armed men. They were mounted and ready to ride, their faces grim with purpose. "Going somewhere, Whitmore?" Harrison asked, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "I'm going to honor the invitation I was given," Thomas replied, walking toward the barn where Bessie was stabled. "Not alone, you're not." Harrison spurred his horse to block Thomas's path. "We're coming with you to make sure you remember whose side you're on." Thomas felt his temper flare. "I'm not on anybody's side. I'm trying to prevent a war. By collaborating with the enemy? By talking like civilized human beings instead of shooting first and asking questions later." The confrontation might have escalated, but Sheriff Reynolds rode up at that moment, his badge catching the sunlight. He brought 5 of his best men, all armed, but trying to look official rather than hostile. "Colonel, I think it's best if you let me handle this," Reynolds said diplomatically. "This is a law enforcement matter now." Harrison's face turned red. With anger. "Law enforcement? The law doesn't apply when we're dealing with savages?" The law applies everywhere in this territory," Reynolds replied firmly. "And I'm telling you to stand down." For a moment, Thomas thought Harrison might refuse. The colonel had enough men to overpower the sheriff's small group, and the look in his eyes suggested he was considering it. But finally he wheeled his horse around and rode off, taking most of his followers with him. Reynolds turned to Thomas with a wary expression. "I can't stop you from going, but I can't protect you either. If something happens out there, you're on your own." Thomas nodded and continued toward the barn. As he saddled Bessie, he could feel dozens of eyes watching his every move. Word of his departure would spread quickly, and by the time he returned, the situation would probably be even worse. The ride to the meeting place took about an hour, through rolling hills covered with autumn grass and scattered groves of aspen trees. Thomas had never been this far into what was considered Native American territory, and he found himself looking over his shoulder more often than he cared to admit. He found Chief Running Bear waiting in a meadow beside a small stream, exactly where Gray Wolf had said he would be. The chief was younger than Thomas had expected, maybe 40 years old, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without saying a word. He sat on a magnificent black horse, wearing simple buckskin clothes decorated with intricate quillwork. 2 other men waited with him. One was Gray Wolf, who nodded respectfully as Thomas approached. The other was a woman, and Thomas's breath caught when he realized it was White Moon herself. She looked completely different from the frozen, desperate person he'd found in the storm. Her long black hair was braided with silver ornaments, and she wore a dress of soft doeskin decorated with beautiful beadwork. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They held the same intelligence and strength he'd glimpsed during the blizzard, but now there was something else there too. Gratitude and maybe something more complicated. Chief Running Bear spoke first, his English slow but clear. "You came alone." "This shows honor. I gave my word," Thomas replied simply. "Words are easy. Keeping them when it is dangerous, this is harder." The chief gestured toward a blanket spread on the ground. "Sit, we will talk." Thomas dismounted and sat cross-legged on the blanket, feeling awkward but trying to show respect. White Moon poured him a cup of something that smelled like mint tea, her movements graceful and deliberate. "My daughter tells me you asked for nothing when you helped her," Running Bear continued. "This is unusual for white men." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "She was freezing to death. I couldn't just leave her there." "Many of your people would have," White Moon said quietly. It was the first time he'd heard her speak in complete sentences, and her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent. "My daughter was educated at the mission school," Running Bear explained, noticing Thomas's surprise. "She speaks your language better than most whites speak ours." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping the mint tea while Thomas tried to process everything that was happening. Finally, Running Bear leaned forward, his dark eyes serious. "The winters here are hard," the chief said. "For your people, and for mine, this year will be harder than most. The buffalo herds are smaller, the crops were poor. Many will suffer when the cold comes." Thomas nodded. His own ranch was struggling, and he knew most of the other settlers were in similar situations. "But your land," Running Bear continued, "has good grass, protected valleys where cattle can survive the worst storms. And our land has better grass for summer grazing, closer to water." Thomas began to see where this conversation was heading, and it made his palms sweat. "I propose something that has never been done before," Running Bear said. "A trade between our peoples. In winter, your cattle graze in our protected valleys. In summer, they use our high pastures. In return, we receive beef and grain to feed our families when hunting is poor." The proposal hit Thomas like a physical blow. It was brilliant, practical, and completely impossible. No white rancher in the territory would even consider such an arrangement. "Your people would never accept it," Thomas said finally. "And mine have their doubts as well," Running Bear admitted. "But I believe it could work. You showed kindness to my daughter when you gained nothing from it. This tells me you are different from other whites." White Moon leaned forward, her eyes intense. "My father is offering you something no white man has ever been offered. A true partnership, not conquest or submission, but cooperation." Thomas felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. His ranch was failing, his cattle were dying, and winter was coming fast. This arrangement could save everything he'd worked for. But accepting it would make him an outcast among his own people, maybe even get him killed. "I need time to think," he said finally. Running Bear nodded. "Take all the time you need. But know this, the offer will not remain open forever. Winter comes whether we are ready or not." As Thomas rode back toward his ranch, his mind was spinning with possibilities and dangers. Behind him, he could feel White Moon watching until he disappeared over the ridge. Ahead of him waited angry settlers who already suspected him of treason. The choice he made in the next few days would determine not just his own future, but possibly the future of everyone in the territory. The ride back to his ranch felt like the longest hour of Thomas's life. With every step Bessie took, he could feel the weight of Running Bear's offer pressing down on his shoulders. By the time he saw his house in the distance, his shirt was soaked with sweat. Despite the cool autumn air, the camp of angry settlers had grown even larger while he was gone. Thomas counted at least 60 men now, with more dust clouds on the horizon suggesting others were still arriving. They'd set up a proper military-style camp with organized fire pits and guard rotations. Someone had even brought a cannon from the old fort, its black barrel pointing ominously toward the hills where Running Bear's people lived. Colonel Harrison was waiting for him at the edge of the camp, his face red with anger and suspicion. "Well, Whitmore, what kind of deal did you make with your savage friends?" Thomas dismounted slowly, trying to buy time to think. "We just talked, nothing more." "Don't lie to me, boy." Harrison grabbed Thomas's arm roughly. "You were gone for 2 hours. Nobody talks for 2 hours without making some kind of arrangement." A crowd began gathering around them, all demanding to know what had happened. Thomas could see the fear and anger in their faces, the same mob mentality that had been building since yesterday. These men were looking for any excuse to start shooting, and his meeting with Running Bear had only made things worse. "They offered me a trade agreement," Thomas said finally. Knowing he couldn't hide it forever, the crowd erupted in angry voices. Someone shouted, "Traitor!" while another man spit in the dirt near Thomas's feet. Harrison's grip on his arm tightened until it hurt. "What kind of trade?" The colonel demanded. Thomas explained the proposal as simply as he could, watching the faces around him grow darker with each word. When he finished, the silence was more frightening than the shouting had been. "You're seriously considering this?" asked William Fletcher, his voice dripping with disgust. "You want to let savages use our land?" "It's my land," Thomas replied, though his voice sounded weak even to himself. "Not anymore it isn't," Harrison snapped. "The territorial governor is sending troops. When they get here, you'll be arrested for collaborating with hostiles. This ranch will be confiscated, and you'll be lucky if you don't hang for treason." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. He'd known there would be consequences, but he hadn't expected them to be this severe. "I haven't committed any crimes." "Meeting with enemy leaders is a crime during wartime," Harrison replied coldly. "And as of this morning, the territorial government has declared a state of war." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. War. Because he'd given his coat to a freezing woman. The territory was now officially at war with the local tribes. The irony was so bitter he almost laughed. Jake pushed through the crowd and stood beside Thomas, his old rifle cradled in his arms. "You folks are talking nonsense. Thomas ain't done nothing wrong." "Stay out of this, old man," someone yelled. "You're probably in on it too." "I've lived in this territory for 30 years, Jake shot back. "I've seen what real Indian troubles look like, and this ain't it. You're all getting worked up over nothing." But Thomas could see that Jake's words weren't making any difference. The crowd was beyond reason now, fed by fear and whiskey and the kind of hatred that comes from not understanding something different. That evening, as Thomas sat in his house under what amounted to house arrest, he tried to think through his options. Outside, he could hear the men talking around their fires, planning what they'd do when the territorial troops arrived. Some wanted him arrested immediately. Others thought he should be forced to lead them to Running Bear's camp for a surprise. Around midnight, Jake knocked quietly on his door. The old ranch hand looked exhausted, his face lined with worry. "Boss, I've been listening to them talk," Jake whispered. "Some of the boys are planning to ride out before dawn, attack the Indian camp while it's still dark. They figure if they kill Running Bear, the whole problem goes away." Thomas felt sick to his stomach. How many men? Maybe 20, led by that hothead Fletcher? They're drunk enough to think it's a good idea, and scared enough to go through with it. Thomas knew he had to do something. If Fletcher's group attacked Running Bear's camp, it would mean war for real. Innocent people would die, including White Moon, and any chance of peace would be destroyed forever. "Jake, I need you to do something for me," Thomas said quietly. "Take Bessie and ride hard for Running Bear's camp. Warn them what's coming." Jake nodded grimly. "What about you, boss?" "I'm going to try to stop Fletcher's group before they leave." Thomas slipped out the back door of his house and made his way carefully through the camp. Most of the men were asleep, but he could see a group gathered around one of the fires, their voices low and urgent. Fletcher was in the center, gesturing with a whiskey bottle as he outlined his plan. "We hit them just before dawn," Fletcher was saying. "Kill the leaders first, scatter the rest. By the time the cavalry gets here, it'll all be over." Thomas stepped into the firelight, causing several men to reach for their weapons. "You can't do this, Fletcher. It's murder." Fletcher turned toward him with bloodshot eyes and a sneer on his face. "Look, who's talking? The Indian lover wants to protect his friends." "I'm trying to protect everyone," Thomas replied. "If you attack that camp, Running Bear's allies will come for revenge. Every settlement in the territory will be burned to the ground." "Maybe," Fletcher admitted with a shrug. "But at least we'll go down fighting instead of making deals with savages." Thomas realized there was no reasoning with these men. They were too drunk, too scared, and too convinced that violence was the only solution. He was going to have to find another way to stop them. "At least wait until the troops arrive," Thomas pleaded. "Let the cavalry handle this properly." Fletcher laughed bitterly. "The cavalry's 3 days away, assuming they even come. We can't wait that long." As Thomas walked back toward his house, his mind was racing. He had maybe 4 hours before Fletcher's group rode out to commit what would essentially be genocide. Jake was already riding hard to warn Running Bear, but that might not be enough. The chief's people would be caught between Fletcher's attack and the arriving cavalry, with nowhere to run. Sitting on his porch in the darkness, Thomas made the hardest decision of his life. He was going to accept Running Bear's offer, not because it would save his ranch, but because it was the only way to prevent a massacre. If he could announce a formal trade agreement, it might give the territorial authorities pause long enough. For cooler heads to prevail, the consequences would be severe. He'd be branded a traitor by his own people, lose everything he'd worked for, and probably spend the rest of his life as an outcast. But White Moon had risked her life to beautify his coat, and Running Bear had offered him a chance for real peace. Some things were worth more than personal safety. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Thomas saddled his fastest horse and rode toward what he knew would be the most important meeting of his life. Thomas rode harder than he'd ever ridden in his life, pushing his horse across the rough terrain as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky. Behind him, he could see dust clouds that meant Fletcher's group was already on the move. He had maybe an hour before they reached Running Bear's camp, and he was the only thing standing between peace and a bloodbath when he reached the meadow where he'd met with Running Bear the day before. Thomas found it empty except for a few scattered ashes from an old fire. His heart sank as he realized the chief's people had moved their camp. Jake might have warned them in time, but now Thomas had no idea where to find them. That's when he heard the thunder of hoofbeats behind him. Thomas turned to see Fletcher's raiders cresting the hill, their faces painted with war paint in a sick mockery of their enemies. They'd spotted him, and Fletcher was pointing in his direction while shouting orders to his men. Thomas spurred his horse toward the tree line, hoping to lose them in the thick forest. But his mount was exhausted from the hard ride, and Fletcher's men were gaining ground fast. Within minutes, they had him surrounded in a small clearing, their rifles all pointed at his chest. Well, well, Fletcher said with a nasty grin. Look what we caught. The Indian lover himself, probably riding to warn his savage friends. You can't do this, Fletcher, Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. This is murder you're planning. Murder? Fletcher laughed. We're protecting our families from hostile savages. That's not murder, that's duty. One of Fletcher's men, a young farmer named Henry, looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. Maybe we should just go back, Bill. The cavalry will be here. Soon enough. The cavalry ain't coming fast enough, Fletcher snapped. By the time they get here, Running Bear could have attacked half the settlements in the territory. Thomas could see the fear in these men's eyes, the same fear that had been driving all the bad decisions since this whole thing started. They weren't evil men, just scared fathers and husbands who thought they were protecting their families. Listen. To me, Thomas said urgently, Running Bear doesn't want war. He wants to trade to find a way for both our peoples to survive the winter. If you attack his camp, you'll be starting something that will get a lot of innocent people killed. Innocent? Fletcher's voice rose to a shout. There ain't no innocent savages. They're all killers waiting for their chance to strike. That's when the forest around them erupted with movement. Native American warriors seemed to materialize from behind every tree and rock, their weapons trained on Fletcher's group. The raiders found themselves outnumbered 3-1, caught in a perfect ambush. Running Bear stepped into the clearing, his face calm but his eyes deadly serious. Lower your weapons, he said in clear English, all of you. Fletcher's men looked around wildly, realizing they were completely trapped. Some started to lower their rifles, but Fletcher himself raised his weapon toward Running Bear. Don't! Thomas shouted, but Fletcher was already squeezing the trigger. The shot rang out across the forest, but Running Bear was no longer where he'd been standing. The chief had moved with lightning speed, and Fletcher's bullet hit nothing but empty air. Before Fletcher could fire again, 2 warriors had him on the ground, his rifle kicked away into the underbrush. You came to kill sleeping families, Running Bear said, standing over Fletcher. In our law, this makes you no better than animals. Thomas held his breath, expecting the worst. By rights, Running Bear's people could kill every one of Fletcher's men and be justified under any code of frontier justice. But the chief surprised everyone. But we are not animals, Running Bear continued. We will not start a war by killing fools. He gestured to his warriors, who began gathering up the raiders' weapons but made no move to harm them. You will go back to your people, Running Bear told Fletcher. You will tell them what you have seen here. Tell them that we could have killed. You all but chose mercy instead. Tell them that we want peace, not war. Fletcher struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and rage. This ain't over, Chief. The cavalry's coming, and when they get here, they'll finish what we started. Perhaps, Running Bear replied calmly. Or perhaps wise men will find a better way. As Fletcher's group was escorted out of the forest, minus their weapons but otherwise unharmed, Running Bear turned to Thomas. You tried to warn us, why? Thomas dismounted and faced the chief. Because I don't want people to die for no reason. And because I've made my decision about your offer. And what is that decision? Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would change his life forever. I accept. I want to make this trade agreement work. Running Bear studied him for a long moment. You understand what this will cost you? Your own people will turn against you. They already have, Thomas replied. But maybe if we can show them that cooperation works better than fighting, they'll change their minds. White Moon emerged from the trees, leading Thomas's exhausted horse. The first winter will be the test, she said quietly. If your cattle survive on our protected lands, and if our people are fed through the cold months, then others might see the wisdom in this. Over the following weeks, Thomas learned just how right Running Bear had been about the cost. When news of the trade agreement spread through the territory, the reaction was swift and brutal. The bank called in his loans, demanding immediate payment he couldn't possibly make. Local merchants refused to sell him supplies. His neighbors stopped speaking to him entirely. Colonel Harrison led a group that tried to force him off his land, claiming he'd forfeited his rights by consorting with hostiles. When that failed, they organized a complete economic boycott. No one would buy his beef, sell him grain, or do business with him in any way, but Running Bear kept his word. When the first blizzard of winter hit in November, Thomas's cattle were safely grazing in the protected valleys the chief had promised. The animals that would have died in the open range were warm and well-fed. Sheltered from the worst of the storm. In return, Thomas delivered regular supplies of beef and grain to Running Bear's people. It wasn't easy, especially with his former neighbors actively working against him, but he managed to keep his end of the bargain. The arrangement brought unexpected benefits. White Moon began visiting the ranch regularly, ostensibly to check on the cattle, but really to help Thomas navigate the complex social and practical aspects of the agreement. She taught him about Native American customs, helped him understand which of Running Bear's people he could trust, and gradually became his closest advisor. By midwinter, Thomas realized he was falling in love with her. It was a dangerous feeling in a territory where interracial relationships were not just frowned upon but could get both people killed. But White Moon was unlike anyone he'd ever met. She was intelligent, brave, and had a way of seeing solutions where others saw only problems. The real test came in February, during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Thomas's cattle were safe in the protected valleys, but Running Bear's people were running low on the food supplies they'd been promised. The merchants in town refused to sell Thomas the grain he needed, even at inflated prices. That's when White Moon came up with a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. If the white merchants wouldn't sell to Thomas, maybe they'd be willing to trade directly with her people. It would be the first time in anyone's memory that Native Americans had engaged in formal commerce with a frontier town. The plan worked, but it also changed everything. Suddenly, the economic boycott against Thomas became meaningless. Running Bear's people had their own money, their own trade relationships, and their own power in the local economy. By spring, Thomas's ranch was the most prosperous in the territory, and his model of cooperation had quietly inspired similar arrangements elsewhere. But success came with a price he was still learning to pay. 1 year later, Thomas stood on the same porch where this whole incredible journey had begun, watching the sunrise paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and pink. The man looking out at the landscape was different from the uncertain young rancher who'd inherited his father's struggling ranch. That man had been soft, inexperienced, and desperately trying to prove he belonged on the frontier. This man had found his place through the hardest lesson of his life. The ranch around him hummed with activity that would have been unimaginable a year ago. In the eastern pastures, his cattle grazed peacefully alongside horses belonging to Running Bear's people. Native American children played near the creek with the sons and daughters of his few remaining white ranch hands. The sound of different languages mixing in casual conversation had become as natural as the wind through the grass. White Moon emerged from the house behind him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the simple cotton dress she preferred for ranch work. 6 months ago, she'd become his wife in a ceremony that scandalized the territory and made newspaper headlines as far away as Denver. The wedding had been small, attended only by Running Bear's people and Jake, who'd stood proudly as Thomas's best man despite threats from his own family. "The territorial governor's wagon is coming," White Moon said quietly, handing him his coffee. "I can see the dust cloud from the road." Thomas nodded, feeling the familiar knot in his stomach that came whenever officials arrived. Governor Mitchell had sent word that he was coming for a personal inspection of the ranch, supposedly to investigate reports of irregular activities on the frontier. Everyone knew what that really meant. The territorial government was finally ready to deal with the Thomas Whitmore problem. "Whatever happens," Thomas said, taking White Moon's hand, "I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made." She smiled, but he could see the worry in her dark eyes. "My father's warriors are watching from the hills. If, the governor tries to arrest you, it could mean war." "No," Thomas said firmly, "no more violence. We've come too far to throw it all away now." The governor's procession was impressive, designed to show the power and authority of the territorial government. 20 cavalry soldiers rode in formation, their blue uniforms crisp and their weapons polished. Behind them came a fancy carriage carrying Governor Mitchell himself, followed by wagons full of clerks and officials. Jake ambled over from the barn, his old rifle conspicuously absent for the first time in months. "You sure about this, boss? That's a lot of soldiers for a friendly visit." "I'm sure," Thomas replied. Though his mouth was dry as dust, Governor Mitchell stepped down from his carriage with the practiced dignity of a career politician. He was a small man with carefully waxed mustaches and the soft hands of someone who'd never done physical labor. But his eyes were sharp and calculating, taking in every detail of the ranch with obvious interest. "Mr. Whitmore," the governor said formally, "I trust you know why I'm here." "I assume it's about the trade agreements," Thomas replied. "Trade agreements?" The governor laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call this? Collaborating with hostiles during a declared state of war?" Thomas felt White Moon tense beside him, but he kept his voice steady. "The war exists only on paper, Governor. Out here we found a better way." "Have you indeed?" Governor Mitchell gestured toward his secretary, who pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I have reports of Native Americans conducting business in territorial towns. I have complaints from ranchers about unfair competition. I have newspaper articles calling you everything from a hero to a traitor." "Which do you think I am?" Thomas asked. The governor studied him for a long moment. "That depends on what I see here today." What followed was the strangest inspection Thomas could have imagined. Instead of finding evidence of treason or collaboration with enemies, Governor Mitchell found a thriving ranch operation that had transformed the local economy. Thomas's cattle were healthier and more numerous than any in the territory. His grain stores were full, his equipment was in perfect condition, and his books showed profits that made other ranchers green with envy. More importantly, the governor found peace. There had been no raids, no attacks, no violence of any kind in the region since the trade agreements began. While other parts of the territory dealt with constant skirmishes and fear, this area had become an island of stability and prosperity. "I don't understand," Governor Mitchell admitted after touring the ranch for 2 hours. "According to every report I've received, this should be a disaster. You should be dead, your ranch should be burned, and we should be fighting a full-scale war. Instead," Thomas said quietly, "we're all better off than we were before." That evening, the governor joined Thomas and White Moon for dinner, along with Running Bear and several other tribal leaders who'd arrived for the occasion. It was the first time in territorial history that government officials had sat down for a formal meal with Native American chiefs, and everyone knew they were making history. The conversation was careful at first, with both sides testing the waters. But as the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. These men began talking not as enemies or strangers, but as neighbors trying to solve common problems. Running Bear spoke about the challenges his people faced with changing buffalo herds and harsh winters. Governor Mitchell discussed the territorial government struggles with budget shortfalls and pressure from Washington. Thomas found himself translating not just languages but worldviews, helping each side understand the other's perspective. "You know," the governor said finally, setting down his coffee cup, "this is not at all what I expected to find here." "What did you expect?" White Moon asked. "Chaos, violence, proof that cooperation between our peoples is impossible." He paused, looking around the table. "Instead, I find the most peaceful and prosperous region in the territory." 3 days later, Governor Mitchell made an announcement that shocked everyone who heard it. Instead of arresting Thomas or shutting down the trade agreements, he officially endorsed the arrangement as territorial policy. The Whitmore Ranch model, as it came to be known, would be encouraged throughout Montana Territory. The news spread like wildfire, bringing a parade of visitors to the ranch. Other ranchers came to learn how the system worked. Newspaper reporters arrived to write stories about the miracle on the Montana frontier. Even officials from Washington came to see if the model could be applied in other territories. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Colonel Harrison and his followers continued to oppose any cooperation with Native Americans, and there were still people who called Thomas a traitor behind his back. But their voices grew quieter as the success of the new approach became undeniable. Standing on his porch now, watching his mixed community go about their daily work, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. It had all started with the simplest possible act, giving his coat to a stranger who was cold. That moment of basic human kindness had somehow grown into something that changed an entire territory. White Moon joined him again, this time carrying their newborn son, a baby who would grow up in a world where cooperation between different peoples was normal rather than revolutionary. The child would never know a time when Native Americans and white settlers were automatically enemies, when fear ruled over common sense. "Do you ever regret it?" White Moon asked softly. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Thomas looked out at his thriving ranch, at the children playing together regardless of their heritage, at the proof that different peoples could work together for mutual benefit. He thought about that cold night in the blizzard when he'd made a choice based on nothing more complicated than human decency. "Never," he said, wrapping his arms around his wife and son. "Not for a single moment." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors that reminded Thomas of the beadwork on his transformed coat. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of laughter mixing with the evening songs of his diverse community. It was the sound of a future he'd never imagined but had somehow helped create. Old because he'd once decided that kindness mattered more than fear.